it is a real honor for me to be here to be talking to you. And particularly, it's a remarkable thing for me that this book has been translated now into Vietnamese. And I can tell you how long ago I started working on this book. I can date it pretty much to the week, because my son was very young, and I'd been helping looking after him at home. Then suddenly a place came up at day nursery, and he went off to nursery, and I had time to start working on the book that I wanted to work on while I was on sabbatical. And that happened when he was 4 months old, and he's now just had his 33rd birthday. So that's when I started working on the first edition of this book. And when I wrote it, it didn't occur to me there'd even be a second edition. It wasn't that common, I think, in the UK for people to write a second edition, but the publishers wanted me to do that eventually, and then the third edition, and then more recently the fourth edition. And I'm pleased to do it, a little bit reluctant because it's more work to come up with new editions. But the main reason for changing is the world is changing, and that it would be wrong to have an introduction to political philosophy that was 30 years old. And that is particularly reflected in the last chapter, where I, in the last couple of editions, have tried debates that are not carried forward in the earlier chapters. So climate change, for example, 30 years ago, there was no philosophical discussion of climate change. There was also, interestingly, no philosophical discussion of disability that I knew about. But that is now a very important topic. Global justice is another issue that has come onto the agenda. So I've tried to keep up to date to some degree, at least with that last chapter. But if someone, when the first edition came out, if someone said there'll be a fourth edition, I would have laughed at them. If they'd said there was there'd be a Vietnamese translation, that would have just seemed to me absurd. Why would there be? Particularly as the traditions of philosophy have been so different in the past. But I think we're beginning to see more respect around the world for other traditions, and students being more interested in learning about what happens elsewhere in the world as well as in their own traditions. So we'll see what happens in the future and where we go from now, because maybe some aspects of the world are out of keeping with this, and a bit more isolationism as well as a political level, even while there's more intellectual curiosity. So I was asked to talk about this topic here today, social trust and the role of the state. And I wanted to do it in a way that was both relevant and interacted with the topics of the book. So I've got to talk on a piece of paper. I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to manage some paper and a microphone and a PowerPoint pointer, but luckily for all of us, I've only got a few slides, so I don't have to be very active. So let me get going. So I want to talk about social trust and the role of governments. And I'm going to begin by talking about the nature of trust. And social trust is an urgent concern around the world. And it's even said that there is a crisis of trust. Now, you probably can't read the slide. I'm not really a slides person, but I thought this was quite an important slide. But you can see the tendency of this slide. So we've got a graph that is going down. It begins in 1960 with a reading of about 75%, 76%. It ends up round about 2023, and that has fallen to 16%. So what is it showing? Well, this is a graph from the Pew Research Center in the United States, which is a respected non-partisan research center. I think it is widely respected as a neutral research organization. And it asks the question, do you trust your government to do what is right just about always, or at least most of the time? So in 1964, 77% of the US population trusted the government to do what was right just about always or most of the time. And in 2023, that had fallen to a mere 16%. So that's not even do you trust your government to do what's right just about always, which is a tiny, tiny figure now. Almost no one says they trust the American government to do the right thing just about always, but most of the time. So what should we make of these figures? We can be very suspicious. People may exaggerate how bad they think things are. So survey data is always suspect. And this is about America. So we can't generalize to other countries. We need to look at the data for other countries. And it can be very hard to make comparisons because people use different methodologies for different surveys. But we do have the striking fact that trust in government is going down in America. But it's also something of an ambiguous question because it could be a question about government in general, or it could be a question about the administration in power now. So you may have a lot of people who would say, yes, I trust governments, I just don't trust this government. I don't trust these people, right? So that would be quite a common thing. So what's remarkable, actually, is a figure from the 1960s, where people said they did trust the government, and they would be trusting governments they'd voted against in many cases. So we have at least one country where it is documented that trust is falling. Now, I'm a philosopher, I'm not an empirical social scientist. I'm not going to be looking at the data in detail. I'm not going to be looking at comparative data. I want to look at the question about why is this a problem? Why is it perceived to be a problem that trust in government is falling? So let's start with the basic philosophical question. What is trust to begin with? That it's one thing to say your trust is falling. It's another thing to say, what do you mean by trust? And I'm guessing that if these people had been asked, what do they mean by trust? They might struggle to tell us what it is. So I like to start slowly. And so I would like to start with an example of when do you need to trust people? So think about other people now rather than the government. So trust in ordinary life. So imagine an ordinary situation. You've got a young child and you want to go out for the evening. So you need a babysitter. What are you going to say in this? Well, first of all, you're going to say, I need someone I trust, I can trust. So this is an area where trust will come up. What would you be looking for? Well, here's what came to mind when I thought, first of all, someone who knows the needs of young children or could learn them very quickly. That's something you'd need. Second, someone who's careful, not reckless or negligent. Probably you want someone who's empathetic or kind, and someone who would be quick to take action if need be. So if there's a crisis, they call you or the doctor. So those are the features that you would be looking for. Maybe other things too. But these things will be more important than whether the person, say, is a family member. Because you might have a family member who's very forgetful. You could have a family member who is unreliable for all sorts of reasons. So it's most likely that the person you trust will be a family member, and their being a family member will make them more likely to be trustworthy. But it's the features you're after rather than them being a member of the family. Now, what is so interesting about this is if you find someone who is an ideal babysitter, kind, caring, you know they won't panic, they'll call you if there's a problem, you can forget about your child for the evening. That is the dream, in any case. Whether you actually would do is another matter. But a postdoctoral student who worked with me wrote what I thought a brilliant definition of trust. And she said to trust is to defocus comfortably. So trust is comfortable defocusing. That is, you can take your mind off something and you are comfortable doing that. You're sort of entitled to take your mind off things if you trust. Now, if you have a babysitter you didn't trust, what are your options? Well, you could defocus, but that would be reckless if you take your mind off. More likely, you just won't take your mind off the person. So if you've got a babysitter you don't trust, maybe it's someone who can't take their eyes off their mobile phone, say, will never look up, you're going to phone them every 30 minutes. Now, you're not going to defocus. So I love this idea of trust as comfortable defocusing. If you just don't have to think about that. If you trust something, you don't have to think about it. So another way that people have talked about this is trust as reliance for good reasons. You trust if you can rely on something for good reasons. Okay. So what are the benefits of trust? Well, the obvious ones are it gives you space. If you trust things, you can use your mental capacities for other things. You can get on with watching the film, watching the theater, getting on with your philosophical manuscript. You can do all of these things with your mind free from other things. Now, one of the most important contributions comes from one of the philosophers I talk about in an introduction to political philosophy. This is Thomas Hobbes. Now, Thomas Hobbes was born in 1588 and died in 1679 at the very old age of 91, very old for those days. He wrote a number of books, but his most famous is called Leviathan, and it was published in 1651, just at the end of the English Civil War and the execution of the king, Charles I. So Hobbes witnessed the crumbling of state power. State power fell apart in his lifetime, and his country descended into civil war without a government. And Hobbes argued that we would live in a society of war of all against all if we didn't have a government. Everyone would be an enemy of everyone else. We would live in mutual suspicion. Now, one of the most famous lines in the whole of political philosophy is Hobbes's description of the state of nature, which he says, life in the state of nature would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So if we lived without government, your life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But I'm more interested today in the lines he says before that. And Hobbes says, without government, there's no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain. So why would you manufacture anything if there's no government to enforce the law? Other people would take it. They might destroy your factory. They might take your goods. So there's no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain. And consequently, no culture of the earth. Who would be a farmer if you had to rely on your own security for your crops or your animals? No navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea. No commodious building. No one would build anything that was comfortable because other people might take it from you. No instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force. No knowledge of the face of the earth. No account of time. That's very interesting. Without the government, we wouldn't have clocks. Even he thinks that we might argue about that one. But no arts, no letters, and no society. So this is a bleak picture. And we can argue about the details, and anarchists disagree with Hobbes. But Hobbes's basic idea is that without the security of government, we would not have the benefits of civilization. Now, the key point here, I think, for us, isn't so much about the existence of government, but the security that government brings. Because without government, you have to look after yourself. You have to spend so much time and energy securing your own existence. We'll be constantly on the lookout against threats, trying to make ourselves safe. It will be a struggle even to get the basic goods of food, clothing, and shelter that we need to survive from one day to another. But the implication is, in a better society, when you can start to trust other people, you have the space to be creative. Creative in arts, but also creative in industry, creative in agriculture, creative in navigation. So once you've got a background of law and order that you can trust, everything else becomes possible. Where law and order breaks down, then we lose that security. Now, so far, I've spoken of the benefit of trust for the person doing the trusting. But of course, there are two parties involved. There's also the person who's being trusted. Is there a benefit of being trusted, as well as a benefit of being to trust those around you? Now, again, the trusted person is given space. Imagine you have a boss who distrusts you. That boss, let's say, is sacked for good reason. They're too suspicious. And they're replaced with a boss who now trusts you. What would the difference be? Well, you would have space to make your own decisions, space to supervise your own work, space to take your own initiative. This can be liberating, but of course it has a cost, because trust can easily be abused. And so the reason why there's often micromanagement of people is that there needs to be, and that if they're trusted, they will abuse that trust. So there's a danger of misplaced trust, trusting things and people we shouldn't trust. And once you've been let down or betrayed, it can be very hard to trust again. So this is an important lesson. When trust is lost, it's quite hard to build it back up again. But the general idea is, if you're trusted, then you don't have a sense of being watched, and you have much more sense of being a mature, autonomous, responsible individual. In fact, if you're trusted, you feel respected. And trust and respect seem to go together. But let's move to the topic of trust and distrust in government now. Now, Hobbes, as we saw, referred to the situation in which there was no government as a state of war of all against all. He didn't mean there'd be constant fighting, but rather constant suspicion. You'd be constantly need to take guard, constant readiness to fight or defend. But if we pass a powerful government that makes and enforces laws, then we can start to trust each other. And that, as we've seen for Hobbes, is a precondition of prosperity. Not because people are naturally good. Hobbes certainly didn't think people were naturally good, but because they fear that if they break the law, they'll be punished. And so the rule of law creates a stable background. Now, Hobbes is mostly interested, though, in citizens trusting each other. Hobbes doesn't talk very much about citizens trusting the government. Maybe he takes it for granted that if the government is strong enough, people will trust. But let's think about this question now in the modern world rather than Hobbes's world. So when will people trust their governments, and when will they not trust their governments? So another philosopher I discuss in an introduction to political philosophy is the philosopher John Rawls, who wrote probably the most important book written in English in political philosophy in the 20th century, called A Theory of Justice, first written in 1971. He wrote a revised version of it a bit later on. Do I advise you to read it if you're new to political philosophy? I advise you to read the chapter in my book about it. Rawls is not an easy writer, and he admitted this himself. The Theory of Justice is very long, over 500 pages. And in the preface, Rawls says, "This is a long book, not only in words." And no one really knows what he even means by that, but you get the sense that he thinks this is going to be a struggle if you're going to try to read it through. So I try to summarize it. Other people have tried to summarize it. If you're feeling very strong, you can read it. But it's good to know what you're going to be reading, or at least have an idea of what you're going to be reading and what's important before you start, because it's hard to, it's not the sort of book that tells you what the important ideas are. It gives you a lot of ideas, and it's quite hard to pick it out at first. But one idea that I have taken from Rawls in some of my own work, and this is not a major idea in Rawls, is the concept of legitimate expectations. So what is this? Suppose you're living in a government, in a society where there are certain rules about taxation, for example. Well, if you do that, you will organize your life around those rules. So if you're in business, you'll order products and you'll maybe decide to expand or not to expand, bearing in mind the tax rate is at a certain level. Or if you're a private citizen, you might save for a house, save for your children's education. If suddenly the laws change, you're going to feel very bad about that situation. You're going to say, I've planned my life around these rules, and if they change, that's going to disturb my plans. It's going to ruin my plans, maybe ruin my life. And that can happen even if you think the change is a good change. So this is quite interesting. So people on the left in my country, in the UK, might theoretically argue for much higher taxes for people like them. But if those taxes came in tomorrow, they'd complain, even though they're in favor of the higher taxes in principle. Why? Well, because they probably want 5 years' notice so they can rearrange their lives to a different tax regime. So if you have a government that constantly changes things, then you can't plan. And here the thought is that you need this background of stable expectations. You form what he calls legitimate expectations. You have a right that these things can continue, even if they're not completely just, even if they need to be reformed. So I think this notion of stability in life is very important. And this is one of the things that trust gives us, that we trust the government that if it's going to introduce a new regime of some sort, it will give us plenty of notice. Then I think we feel much more comfortable planning our lives. So that's the first notion there, the importance of stability and legitimate expectations. It's quite interesting that when I have on the few occasions been involved with some businesses and new taxes are being discussed by government, the people in business say, look, obviously we would prefer a lower tax than a higher tax. Obviously in business you want lower tax, but what we really want is a decision. And we would rather have a decision on a higher tax than indecision, because we just can't plan. Once we've got the rule, once we've got the law, we'll know how to deal with it. But if we have these uncertain scenarios, we just don't know how we're going to be doing business. So we see this at the moment. A lot of countries around the world have stopped mailing small packages to the United States. So my country, the UK, the EU, Japan, I think, has joined in. I don't know whether Vietnam has as well, because they just don't know what the tariff rate is. And the post office doesn't want to be liable for tariffs if it turns out that it's higher than they thought. So the post office can say, I don't care what the tariff is. I just need to know what it is. It can be high, it can be low, it doesn't matter to me. But for as long as I don't know what it is, I cannot do business here. So this is a very interesting illustration, I think, of the importance of stability and, in that way, trust. The other ideas I've got about trust in government, well, these are fairly obvious. At the moment, in some countries, there is a fear around detention and security. So in the United States at the moment, people who have a type of uncertain immigration status are in great fear of being rounded up and deported. So imagine that fear in your life, and how is that going to affect you? Are you going to go to work? Maybe not. Are you going to send your kids to school? Maybe not. Are you going to claim benefits? Maybe not. So if any of these times you don't know whether you're in the category or not, then you will take precautions, perhaps. Competence. So this is another very important part of government, maybe the most important part. You'll trust government if you think it's doing the right thing. But again, we can make a distinction between doing the right thing by way of process, so it acts in a competent way, and doing what you think is the right thing from a policy point of view. So you can think the government is acting very well and acting according to the right procedures, even if you disagree with what it does. So I think this is normal politics. In normal politics, the government isn't going to do what you want a lot of the time. But you can think if there's been a vote, it's gone through the right procedure, if people have had a chance to speak up, if there have been inquiries and they still do what you don't want them to do, you'll say that's just bad luck, that's life. It doesn't stop me trusting the government. It just means I won't get what I want this time. But if you think the government is incompetent, if you think, for example, it's corrupt, then trust will drop. And corruption scandals are everywhere in the world. In my own country, we had a problem during the COVID crisis, that there were very large contracts for protective equipment, for some medications, and far too many of them went to people who didn't have experience of that industry, but had a lot of experience of giving money to the party in power. And so what we found was quite a lot of corruption in terms of donors to the party were getting contracts rather than the people who were best qualified to fulfill them. And we're still trying to unravel some of that. There may be people who end up going to jail, possibly not. But it's going to be hard to find many examples where there aren't some forms of corruption. And the bigger the corruption and the more routine it is, the bigger the problem. Although I once said that in a lecture, and it was pointed out to me that there was an even bigger scandal in the UK when members of parliament were making rather small claims that didn't seem to be justified. And then the pettiness of the claim seemed to reduce confidence in the government even more. That if people claimed for a dry cleaning bill that they weren't entitled to, that shows a sort of level of contempt rather than just trying to get rich at the public expense. So even small corruption, it seems, can undermine trust, at least in the politicians. So security and competence are areas where trust is compromised. None of this so far, though, explains why there is a general trend in trust going down, at least in the United States. So there's always been problems around legitimate expectations and the rule of law. There have always been problems around security, always problems around competence. What is different? Now, it seems from the surveys people do think, at least surveys that I quoted from the United States, that trust is falling. Trust in government is falling. That seems clear. Why? Is it true that things are getting worse? Well, we always think things are getting worse. That if you ask anyone about anything, it's worse than it used to be. No one can tell you when that golden age was, when everything was fantastic. All we can tell is that although standard of living is going up, wages are going up, poverty is falling, crime is falling, life expectancy is rising, but everything is getting worse at the same time. So it's very interesting that we tend to focus on what we think is getting worse. So in my country, in the UK, if you ask, is crime rising or falling? People say it's certainly rising. Well, they can't find that in the data. It seems to be falling. One area I worked on is gambling, the regulation of gambling. And we're very concerned about problem gambling in the UK, people who develop gambling problems. The data shows that for the last 20 or 30 years, despite lots of changes in regulation, the rate of problem gambling has been roughly the same over 20 to 30 years. If you ask literally any member of the British public, is problem gambling going up? They'll say, yes, it's shocking. It's skyrocketing up. So why do they think that? Well, partly because the media's got interested in it. And so they find cases, they find anecdotes. And so you get the tragic story, and this, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, tragic story of people who get into a lot of gambling debt and may steal from their employer, go to jail, in the worst case, take their own lives. And that certainly happens. People think it's happening a lot. It happens a little bit, but the same stories are repeated over and over again in the media. So people think a lot of people are taking their lives through gambling. But there's a story about when it happened, a story about a petition, a story about an inquest, a story about another story, and so on. So we just get this impression that it's getting worse and worse and worse, because that's what used to sell newspapers in the days newspapers sold. Now it's about getting hits on social media or getting the links. And I think social media has caused a lot of problems for politics. We've always had negative stories. We've always had false stories. In America, there used to be something called the yellow press. So the yellow press was based on a newspaper that was printed on yellow paper, hence the name. But it existed just more or less to tell lies about politicians in the end of the 19th century, because it existed in order to sell newspapers. and the way you sold newspapers was telling scandalous stories about politicians. That existed in the 19th century. So this type of lies about politicians to make money is something at least 150 years old, I think. We think we invented it, but we didn't, right? We think this generation invented it. But it's certainly faster than it used to be. And there's no responsibility and there's no comeback now. And the new technologies are making it very difficult. So we knew about Photoshop even a few years ago, where photographs can be manipulated. We now have deep fake videos where people can be said to be saying what they didn't say. We have pornographic deep fake politicians, films now, videos, particularly for female politicians in some countries where people's careers have been ruined by deep fake videos of them. So we've got a real crisis now. And I think there has been a change because 20 or 30 years ago, the media would have made a distinction between what's in the public interest and what's not in the public interests. And so if a politician had a child with a drug problem, 20 or 30 years ago, that might have been kept private. I thought that's got nothing to do with their role as a politician. But now any story will be publicized and will go around the world very, very quickly. So we're seeing much more unfiltered news and lies than we did before. And I think that is contributing to a decline in trust. So let me move on a little bit. We've talked mostly about citizens trusting their governments. We had a little bit about citizens trusting each other. But there's another question that doesn't seem to be raised so much, which is, do governments trust their citizens? And this is quite interesting. If trust in government has fallen, how can it be restored? Because if we also have governments that don't trust their citizens, we seem to be in some sort of spiral where it's very hard to see how we're going to make any improvements. Now, there are some studies, I'm told, about whether people feel trusted by their government, but it's much harder to study whether the government actually does trust the people. What would it mean for the government to trust the people? But think about ways people complain about their governments. So common complaints about governments. First of all, they're taking us for fools, people say. So the government is hiding important information that might actually be quite easy for people to get. So around the COVID times, people thought that governments were hiding important facts from them. And of course, other people came in to make up those facts that the government was hiding from us. So that was the first line. They're taking us for fools. The second is they're treating us like criminals. So when would that be? Well, if you lived in a society where you have to constantly carry your papers and show them to the police all the time, if you are searched when you leave shops, for example, there's a type of presumption that ordinary behavior is criminal behavior. So if you live in a society like that, or your society moves through a period like that, then you will think, my government doesn't trust me. My government wants to check up on me all of the time. And we see this with CCTV cameras everywhere. That well, it's very interesting for you now to reflect on this, because this is something that's in all of our lives. Do you feel that you're not trusted? Or do you feel actually CCTV cameras make you more secure because other people will know they're being watched? You're okay anyway. The CCTV cameras are for other people, not for you. But we have people now who are very worried about face recognition technologies. Do they trust the government with this level of scrutiny? Third thing I've got there, they're treating us like children. So when would you say the government is treating you like children? When it doesn't allow you to do things you think adults should do. So it could be not allowing you to ride your motorcycle the way you want to ride it. Perhaps you want to gamble and your government doesn't allow you to gamble. Perhaps you want to drink more than you find it easy to do in your society, and the government has some sort of public health campaign about it. So this is a big thing, particularly in the United States, to get the idea that the government should get out of our lives. We have lives to lead, and the government is treating us like children. Sometimes I don't know how common this phrase is, but in the UK, we often use, or critics of government use the term, the nanny state, that the state is treating you like a nanny treats a young child, doesn't let you take risks for yourself, doesn't let you organize your own life. Sometimes you can think that the state is treating you as their servants, that the state has its own interests and it's getting you to do things for the state rather than for yourselves. I should have examples of this because it seems like it's something that should be common. It was quite hard for me to think of examples. There are times when governments treat people as a source of income. That goes with corruption as well, rather than it being the government, but particular individuals. But they're treating us like they're servants, you could say. We're serfs rather than citizens. It was very interesting in the language on passports, and I should have looked this up before saying it, but it's just struck me now. It used to be, once upon a time, that in the UK people were referred to as British subjects, but then it moved to British citizens. And this idea, I'm a citizen, not a subject. That is, that I am here with my rights and the government is there to serve me, rather than me being there to serve the government. So this is a way we can complain about governments. And finally, they're ignoring us. Maybe this is the most common of all the objections, that the government just is not interested in me. More likely, the government is not interested in people like me. So it could be the government's not interested in women, or people from my minority race, or people from my religion, or people from my economic class. That the government is only interested in a certain class or character of people, or even none of us. So these are all ways in which people can feel they're not trusted by their government. They're not trusted to make good decisions. They're treated as resources for the government rather than valuable individuals. They're treated as children. But this is an area that is very hard, where it's very hard to get the balance right. And one of the places where I have seen this is actually in Chinese philosophy. So I came to the problem through my involvement in certain aspects in public policy. And there is a type of dilemma about how we should run, how government officials should behave and how they should be regulated. So on the one hand, people in positions of power quite often have a lot of expertise and authority and experience and wisdom. So if you think about your doctor, there was a time in which in the UK, people would go to their doctor and just trust their doctor. They wouldn't interrogate them. There was no Google to look anything up on. So if the doctor told you you needed a treatment, you simply trusted your doctor. Or if you went to a lawyer, the lawyer told you what the law was, and you trusted these people. So these are high trust situations. The problem with them is that people abuse their trust. And so you trusted doctors, but quite often they made really bad decisions and they were unaccountable. You trusted lawyers, some of them cheated you or were negligent. So they need regulation. Who should regulate? Well, the first level is self-regulation. That never lasts long because self-regulation has the same problem as no regulation. So you end up with quite heavily regulated professions and resentment from people in those professions saying they're treating us like criminals, they're treating us like children. So for me, the central dilemma in public policy is how much should we trust individuals to do the right thing, and how much should we make individuals subject to laws and procedures and accountability? And I first came across this in the writings of the British utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham. But I was amazed to see he was 2,000 years late on this debate, and that it is a debate that took place in Chinese legalist philosophy. So I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, but Han Fei, who was a legalist philosopher, wrote a criticism of Confucius. So according to Han Fei, Confucius says we should find trust rulers sorry, we should find wise rulers and trust them. Han Fei says, well, how many did Confucius find? Not even 20. There just aren't the wise rulers to go around. We need to regulate people because otherwise everything will be a mess. So this, I think, is our central dilemma. How do we get this balance right between trusting people, where we face the risk of abuse of trust, or heavily regulating people, where we face two risks. One is people feel insulted, and the other is regulation is always too crude. You can't have regulations that are really as subtle as you need to cover the practice. So this is our central dilemma in public policy, and we haven't solved it in 2,500 years, and we keep rediscovering it in different areas. But it is clear to me that we need rules, but we also need individual discretion, and this is going to be a different balance in different areas and in different societies. But we need to get that right in order to create the right type of high trust society. So my final slide. How do we create a high trust society? Well, trust in government is falling in some countries. When you don't trust your government, that makes life more difficult and more costly for individuals. So lack of trust has a cost. And citizens may also believe that their governments don't trust them. So we can have a downward spiral. So this is our question. The government has to earn trust. The government cannot just claim trust. It can't demand trust. Trust is an attitude. Trust isn't ticking a box. Trust is a feeling in people's heads. So how will government do that? Well, I've got nothing striking to say. So you're welcome to take a photo of the PowerPoint, but it's not going to make your life a lot better by doing this, unfortunately. What I'm going to say is a high trust society is one that has stability, first of all. This doesn't mean it's fossilized, but it manages change in a way in which advance notice is given, people's legitimate expectations are not destroyed. So people don't despair because everything they built up suddenly disappears overnight. So to earn trust, you need stability. It goes without saying you need competence. You also need security. You need to offer people a stable environment. You need law and order to some degree. But, and this goes back to the point about Chinese legalism, you can't have, you need the right balance. You can't only have law and order. There's got to be a large area where people are trusted. And this could be costly because if people are trusted, then they will abuse that trust. Some people will abuse that trust. And what governments have been doing for the last 20 or 30 years, I think, are taking those examples of where people have abused their trust and creating more regulations for everyone, even the people who are not abusing it. So again, we have a dilemma here. Do we let some people get away with it and make things better for others? Or do we try to have a society in which we don't let anyone get away with anything and we make other people pay for that security? Well, what do I mean by this? Well, I'll end in a place I certainly wasn't expecting to end when I started, which is a book by the French philosopher Foucault called Discipline and Punish. And when I read this book, or I have to confess I didn't read all of it, when I read some of this book, I was astonished at how late an invention prisons for criminal behavior are in human history. That they didn't really come into existence, even in wealthy countries, until probably the 20th century. Before that, you had physical punishments, you had transportation, you had branding. You put people in prison for debt, for civil debt, or if they were political prisoners, but not for criminal offenses. Why? Because punishment is incredibly expensive. You have to be a rich country to be able to afford prisons, because you have to put people up and you have to feed them and you have to pay people to guard them. So punishment, law and order, regulation is very expensive. And that comes from the taxpayer. So is the taxpayer better off with more law and order, more prisons, more police that they're paying for, or the occasional crime or the occasional person getting away with something. So again, we've got this balance, this trade-off. There's not a single principle that says, yes, we should eliminate all crime, because eliminating all crime would be so expensive. You would barely be able to do anything else if that was your single goal. But how much should you tolerate? So you should say you're not tolerating any crime. You should never say you're tolerating crime. But behind the scenes, maybe you should accept that you're not going to be able to deal with all crime. So how to create a high trust society? Get this balance right between security and trust. And that's going to be a contextual matter for different societies at different times in different contexts. Okay. Well, thank you very much for listening.